The church was already full when the coffin was carried in, yet the space felt hollow, as if the air itself were holding its breath. Winter light filtered through the tall windows in pale, colorless sheets, barely touching the rows of bowed heads. The young man inside the coffin looked almost asleep, too calm, too untouched by what everyone knew had happened. His face was smooth, his hands folded carefully, a small cross resting between them. Mourners whispered prayers under their breath, their words dissolving into the soft crackle of candle flames. The priest stood near the altar, his voice steady and practiced as he began the rites. He had conducted countless funerals, for the old and the young, the expected and the tragic. Death no longer startled him easily. Yet from the moment he looked upon the deceased, a faint unease settled in his chest. He told himself it was nothing more than sorrow for a life ended too soon. As he continued reading, his eyes returned again to the young man's face. That was when he noticed it, something so small it almost escaped notice. The lips were not fully relaxed. There was the slightest tension there, a subtle curve that did not belong to stillness. Not a smile, not exactly, but an expression that suggested awareness. The priest blinked and looked away. Embalming, muscle memory, light and shadow, there were many explanations. He resumed the prayer without interruption. The congregation stood motionless. A mother near the front clutched a handkerchief so tightly her knuckles had turned white. A friend of the deceased stared at the floor, jaw clenched, as if refusing to let himself remember anything beyond the present moment. The silence between prayers stretched long and heavy. Then the priest felt it again, that pull toward the coffin. Against his will, his gaze drifted back. The strange tension remained, unchanged, and now it seemed more pronounced. His throat tightened. He adjusted his glasses, leaned forward slightly, and told himself not to imagine things. This was not the place for doubt. A faint sound interrupted his thoughts, a whisper of air moving through the church. One candle flickered violently, then another. Within seconds, several flames went out at once. The sound of extinguished wicks echoed unnaturally loud. People shifted uneasily, coats rustling, breath catching. Someone glanced toward the doors, but they were closed, heavy and unmoving. The priest paused mid-sentence. He felt a sudden chill crawl along his arms beneath his robes. The air no longer felt still, it pressed inward, dense and expectant. He lifted his eyes again, heart pounding now, no longer willing to dismiss what he saw. The young man's lips had changed. The tension was clearer, unmistakable. It was as though the muscles beneath the skin were holding themselves in place, resisting the stillness imposed upon them. The priest's hand trembled slightly as he made the sign of the cross. His voice resumed, though it wavered for the first time. A low murmur spread through the congregation. A woman in the second row crossed herself repeatedly. Someone near the back whispered the young man's name, unsure why. The priest felt sweat gather at his temples. He had read about moments of collective fear, about how grief could distort perception, but this felt different. This felt focused, directed. A faint sound rose near the altar, barely audible at first. It was not a voice, not quite, but a vibration, like glass trembling under pressure. The icon beside the coffin gave a soft metallic chime, though no one had touched it. That was when fear truly took hold. The priest stepped closer to the coffin. His instincts screamed at him to stop, to finish the rite quickly and leave this place behind, but something stronger compelled him forward. He leaned down, close enough to see the fine details of the young man's face, the eyelashes resting against pale skin, the stillness that should have been complete. The lips moved, not much, just enough to be seen. A collective gasp swept through the church. Someone cried out. The priest stumbled back, nearly losing his balance. His mind raced for explanation, for doctrine, for anything that could anchor him to reality. He began to pray louder now, faster, words tumbling over each other. The air shifted violently. A deep vibration rolled through the floor, subtle at first, then stronger, like the distant approach of thunder. Candles rattled in their holders. The walls seemed to hum, responding to something unseen. People clutched at each other, some falling to their knees, others frozen in place, eyes wide with terror. Then the church shook, not enough to collapse, not enough to destroy, but enough to be felt by every soul inside. The tremor passed through stone and wood alike, a single, powerful shudder that seemed to originate from the very heart of the building. Dust fell from the ceiling. A few cries rang out, sharp and panicked. And then, silence. The air stilled. The vibration faded. Candles that remained lit burned steadily once more. The priest stood trembling, his prayer unfinished, his faith shaken in a way he had never known. Slowly, cautiously, he approached the coffin again. The young man's face was calm now. The tension was gone. The lips lay relaxed, peaceful, exactly as they should have been from the beginning. There was no sign that anything had happened at all. No one spoke. No one moved. After a long moment, the priest completed the final prayer, his voice barely above a whisper. The words felt inadequate, fragile. When the rite ended, people did not rush to leave. They remained where they were, processing what they had witnessed, unsure whether it had been real or born from collective grief. Outside, the winter light looked unchanged. The world continued as it always had. But those who were inside the church that day knew something had crossed a boundary, something they could neither explain nor forget. The church bells had stopped ringing long before anyone noticed the silence they left behind. What remained was heavier than sound, a pressure that seemed to settle into the stone walls and seep into the wooden pews. The air smelled of incense and cold wax, the familiar scent of ritual and endings. Outside, winter lingered in the streets, but inside the church time felt suspended, as if the moment refused to move forward. The coffin rested at the center, dark and polished, reflecting faint shards of light from the candles arranged around it. Inside lay the young man, barely past adulthood, his features softened by careful preparation. His hair was neatly combed, his skin pale but smooth, his expression serene enough to fool a stranger. Those who knew him better felt the wrongness of it immediately. He had never been this still, this quiet. He had laughed loudly, spoken quickly, lived with an energy that now felt cruelly absent. The priest stood by the altar, hands folded, eyes lowered as he began the prayers. His voice echoed gently, practiced and calm, shaped by years of repetition. He had presided over countless farewells, yet something about this one weighed on him differently. Perhaps it was the age of the deceased, or the way the family sat so rigidly, as though moving might cause them to shatter. He did not allow himself to dwell on it. Ritual demanded focus, not reflection. As he spoke, his eyes lifted briefly, resting on the coffin. That was when the unease began, subtle and easily dismissed. He felt it more than he saw it at first, a quiet dissonance that stirred. Somewhere beneath thought, he continued reading, but his gaze drifted back again, drawn by an instinct he could not name. The young man's lips seemed tense. The priest frowned almost imperceptibly. It was nothing, surely. Muscles sometimes held shape after death, especially in the young. Light played tricks, shadows exaggerated contours. He shifted his stance slightly, the hem of his robe brushing the stone floor, and continued the prayer. The congregation listened in stillness. A father near the aisle stared straight ahead, his face carved into something hard and unreadable. A sister sat with her hands clasped in her lap, nails digging into her skin, grounding herself in pain she could control. Friends filled the back rows, eyes red, shoulders slumped, united by a loss they were too young to carry. The priest's voice rose and fell, steady but distant to his own ears. He felt strangely detached, as though part of him stood somewhere else, watching. The unease returned, stronger now, urging his attention back to the coffin. He looked again. The lips had not changed, yet the sense of tension was undeniable. It was not a smile, not an expression of peace. It was closer to restraint, as if something were being held back. His stomach tightened. He swallowed and adjusted his glasses, leaning forward just enough to change the angle of view. A flicker of movement caught his eye. He froze. No, he told himself firmly. This was grief, exhaustion, imagination. He straightened and forced himself to continue, his voice slightly louder, as though volume alone could dispel doubt. Then a candle went out. The sharp hiss of the extinguished flame sliced through the quiet. Heads turned instinctively. A second candle flickered wildly before dying, then a third. The sudden dimness altered the space, deepening shadows and making the icons along the walls seem to watch more closely. A murmur spread through the congregation. Someone shifted nervously. Another crossed themselves. The priest paused, his heart beating faster than it should have. He felt a draft brush past him, cold and unnatural, yet the doors remained firmly closed. He resumed the prayer, but his voice betrayed him now, trembling just enough to be noticed. The air felt wrong, thick, charged, as if the church were waiting. His skin prickled beneath his robes. Against his better judgment, he looked back at the coffin. The young man's lips had parted. It was slight, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. The priest's breath caught in his throat. He felt a surge of fear so sharp it bordered on pain. His mind raced through doctrine, through explanations both sacred and mundane, but none fit what he was seeing. A woman near the front gasped softly. Another whispered a prayer, her voice breaking. The tension spread, a collective awareness that something was unfolding beyond understanding. The priest stepped closer, drawn by equal parts dread and responsibility. His hand trembled as he lifted it in blessing, fingers stiff. He leaned forward, close enough to see the fine details of the young man's face, the faint shadow beneath the cheekbones, the stillness of the chest, the eyelashes resting like delicate lines against pale skin. Then the lips moved again. This time there was no denying it. A sharp cry rang out from the back of the church. Someone stumbled, knocking against a pew. The priest recoiled, his pulse roaring in his ears. His voice rose instinctively into prayer, faster and louder now, the words spilling out as though urgency alone could restore order. The church responded. A low vibration rippled through the floor, subtle at first, like the hum of distant machinery. The stone beneath their feet seemed to breathe, to resonate with an unseen force. Candles rattled in, their holders, wax trembling. The icons along the walls gave off faint sounds, metal and wood whispering in protest. People clutched one another. Some dropped to their knees, overcome by fear or faith or both. Others stood frozen, eyes wide, unable to move or speak. The air grew colder still, biting at exposed skin. The vibration intensified. It swelled into a single, powerful tremor that surged through the church, making the walls shudder and the ceiling groan softly. Dust drifted down in fine clouds. A collective cry rose, then fell away as abruptly as it had begun. Silence returned. It was absolute, profound, as though the world itself had drawn a line and refused to cross it. The candles that remained lit burned steadily once more, their flames calm and upright. The air felt lighter, though the cold lingered. The priest stood motionless, chest heaving, his prayer unfinished on his lips. Slowly, with a caution born of terror, he turned back to the coffin. The young man lay exactly as he had at the start. His lips were closed, relaxed, peaceful. The tension was gone, replaced by a stillness so complete it seemed final in a way it had not before. No one spoke. Minutes passed, though they felt like seconds. The priest gathered himself, his hands still shaking as he forced his voice to obey him. He completed the final prayers quietly, each word heavy with meaning he had never felt so keenly. When the rite ended, no one moved to leave. They sat or stood where they were, exchanging glances filled with confusion and fear. Some wept openly now, the shock breaking whatever restraint they had held. Others stared at the coffin, searching for reassurance that what they had seen was not real. Eventually, one by one, they rose and filed out into the cold daylight. Outside, the world continued unchanged. Cars passed, snow crunched beneath boots, breath fogged the air, but those who had been inside the church carried something with them, a memory that refused to settle into explanation. They would replay it in quiet moments, question their senses, argue with themselves and with each other. And no matter how much time passed, none of them would ever forget the moment the church itself seemed to respond to something that should not have been there at all. The church bells had stopped ringing long before anyone became aware of the quiet they left behind. The sound faded not into peace, but into something heavier, a silence that pressed against the stone walls and settled into the bones of everyone inside. Incense lingered in the air, thick and sweet, barely masking the colder smell of wax and winter coats damp from melting snow. Pale daylight filtered through tall stained glass windows, breaking into muted colors that never quite reached the center of the church. The coffin rested there, immovable and dark, polished until it reflected the trembling flames of the candles arranged around it. Inside lay the young man. He looked younger than anyone remembered, as if death had erased the harder lines of adulthood and returned him to something unfinished. His hair had been carefully arranged, his hands folded with ceremonial precision, a small wooden cross resting between his fingers. His chest did not rise. His stillness felt absolute. For those who loved him, that stillness was unbearable. His mother sat in the front row, her back straight, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her fingers had gone numb. She had cried all her tears before arriving, and now her face was dry, rigid, almost carved from stone. His father stared forward without blinking, as though looking directly at the coffin might anchor him to reality. Friends filled the pews behind them, young faces pale and exhausted, struggling to reconcile memory with the finality before them. The priest stood at the altar, his robe falling in careful lines around him. He had performed this ritual many times, for people of all ages, yet each service carried its own weight. This one felt heavier. He told himself it was because the deceased was so young, because grief had a sharper edge when it arrived early. He folded his hands and began the prayers, his voice calm, steady, practiced. The words echoed softly through the church, familiar phrases shaped by centuries of repetition. At first, the sound grounded him. He focused on the cadence, the rhythm, the comfort of structure. Ritual existed to guide people through moments like this, to hold them when emotion threatened to overwhelm. Yet even as he spoke, he felt something shift. It was subtle, nothing he could name. A faint discomfort, like a misaligned note in music. He lifted his eyes briefly, letting them rest on the coffin as he continued speaking. That was when he noticed the lips. They were not fully relaxed. At first, he assumed it was an illusion. Light from the candles danced across the young man's face, creating shadows that might exaggerate natural contours. He blinked and looked away, unwilling to let distraction interfere with the rite. Muscles did strange things after death. He had seen it before. There was nothing remarkable about that. He continued reading. Still, the sensation did not fade. Something tugged at his attention, an insistence he could not quite suppress. His gaze drifted back again. The lips looked the same, yet the feeling intensified. It was not a smile. Not peace. It was tension, faint but unmistakable, as though the muscles were holding themselves in place rather than resting. A ripple of unease passed through him. He swallowed and adjusted his glasses, shifting slightly where he stood. His voice remained steady, but his heart had begun to beat faster. The congregation remained silent, absorbed in their own grief. A young woman near the aisle stared at the coffin without blinking, her expression hollow. A man in the back rubbed his hands together repeatedly, unaware he was doing it. The silence between prayers felt longer now, heavier. The priest tried to dismiss his thoughts. This was not the time for imagination. He lowered his eyes to the text and pressed on. Then a candle went out. The sound was small but sharp, a sudden hiss followed by darkness. Several heads turned. Before anyone could react, another flame flickered violently and died. A third followed. A murmur spread through the church, low and uncertain. People shifted in their seats, coats rustling softly. Someone glanced toward the doors, but they remained closed, solid, undisturbed. The priest paused mid-sentence. A chill brushed past him, raising goosebumps along his arms beneath the fabric of his robe. The air felt different now, denser, colder, as if something invisible had moved through the space. He forced himself to continue, though his voice wavered for the first time. He looked back at the coffin. The change was undeniable. The young man's lips had parted, just slightly. The tension was clearer now, the shape altered in a way that could not be blamed on shadow or light. The priest's breath caught in his throat. His mind raced for explanations, muscle release, settling, anything, but none satisfied the fear tightening in his chest. A woman in the second row gasped softly. Someone whispered a prayer under their breath, the words trembling. The sense of unease spread, contagious and fast. The priest stepped closer to the coffin despite himself. His hand shook as he raised it in blessing. He leaned forward, close enough to see details he had avoided before, the unnatural stillness of the chest, the faint discoloration beneath the skin, the eyelashes resting against pale cheeks. Then the lips moved. It was minimal, almost delicate, but unmistakable. A sharp cry broke the silence. Someone stumbled backward, colliding with a pew. Panic flared instantly, raw and unfiltered. The priest recoiled, his heart pounding so hard it drowned out his thoughts. He raised his voice, launching into prayer with desperate urgency, words tumbling over each other. The church answered. A low vibration rippled through the floor, subtle at first, like the hum of distant thunder. The stone beneath their feet seemed to resonate, responding to something unseen. Candles rattled in their holders, their flames bending and shivering. A faint metallic sound came from the icons along the walls, as if they were trembling too. People cried out. Some fell to their knees, hands covering their heads. Others clutched each other, eyes wide with terror. The air grew colder still, sharp against exposed skin, stealing breath. The vibration deepened, growing stronger, rolling through the space in a single, powerful surge. The walls shuddered. Dust drifted down from the ceiling in fine, ghostly clouds. The wooden beams overhead groaned softly, protesting the strain. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the children present seemed frozen, as though instinct had warned them not to make a sound. The candles that remained lit burned calmly once more, their flames steady and upright. The priest stood trembling, his prayer unfinished, his faith shaken in a way he had never known. Slowly, cautiously, he turned back toward the coffin. The young man lay perfectly still. His lips were closed now, relaxed, peaceful. The tension had vanished completely, leaving behind a stillness that felt final in a way it had not before. There was no trace of movement, no sign that anything unusual had occurred. For a long moment, no one trusted their own senses. The priest forced himself to breathe, drawing in the cold air until his heartbeat slowed enough for him to speak. His voice was quiet now, fragile. He finished the final prayers carefully, each word heavy with meaning. The ritual felt different, altered by what had occurred, yet he knew it had to be completed. When the last words were spoken, no one rushed to leave. People remained seated, standing, kneeling, wherever fear had left them. Some wept openly now, the shock breaking whatever restraint they had held. Others stared at the coffin, searching for reassurance that reality had not fractured in front of them. Eventually, one by one, they rose. Coats were pulled on with shaking hands. Silent glances were exchanged, filled with questions no one dared ask aloud. The doors opened, letting in a rush of cold winter air and ordinary daylight. Outside, the world looked unchanged. Snow lay undisturbed along the steps. Cars passed in the distance. The sky hung low and gray, indifferent to what had occurred inside those stone walls. But those who had been there carried something with them as they stepped back into their lives. A memory that resisted explanation. A moment when certainty had cracked, when the boundary between life and death had felt dangerously thin. They would replay it in quiet moments, argue with themselves, search for rational answers. Some would decide it had been grief, hysteria, imagination. Others would never fully believe that. And the priest, long after the church stood empty again, would return alone and sit in the silence, wondering not what he had seen, but why. For one brief moment, it felt as though the church itself had listened.